It was Marvel and not Lucasfilm that canceled the comic, and the sales were fine.
Star Wars, more than just a movie, as we all know, and in the early 80s, it was the Marvel Star Wars comic book series that kept Star Wars alive between the films. Like the film, the comic book series was a hit from the start. The series was growing in sales each year, and with each new film, Marvel would see a jump in new readers. So what happened? In 1986, almost out of the blue, pulled the plug on the Star Wars comic book series. Was this due to declining sales? Was the Star Wars comic book fans moving on? Marvel says the sales at the time were still doing really great. So what was it? This was Star Wars after all. Well, Marvel says they wanted to get focus back on the superhero comic books. But maybe there's more to it than that. Maybe it was the tightening of Lucasfilms on what could or could not be done within the pages of the Marvel comic book series. Could that have turned off the writers and Marvel? Lucasfilms tied up all loose ends with Return of the Jedi, but they wanted to keep all their options open in case they wanted to do a future sequel. What was Marvel to do? Vader, the Emperor, and the Empire was gone. Writer Mary Jo Duff, who joined the Star Wars comic book series with issue 70, and her team had to come up with new villains and stories for the Star Wars heroes. But with Lucasfilms unsure of when the next sequel will happen, or what that sequel would even be about, Mary had her hands tied tightly. In the early days of the Star Wars comics, the Marvel team had always felt the hand of Lucasfilm, limiting them in their storytelling. Original Star Wars comic book series writer Roy Thomas walked away from Star Wars very early into the run, due mostly to the tightening hand of Lucasfilm, who had to approve all issues and put a limit on what could and could not be done, such as they were not allowed to use Darth Vader or anything around the relationship between Luke and Leia. As Roy Thomas put it, they were only really allowed to run in place. And it wasn't just the stories that Lucasfilm, or even George Lucas himself, would have issues with. George Lucas himself loved the story idea that Roy had for a Han Solo adventure. But he wasn't happy at all when he opened the comic book pages to find a 6-foot green rabbit from the story. And after that story ran its course, Jax the Rabbit was never seen in Star Wars again. It was after that run that Roy said he learned that even if he loved the movies, he had no real interest in doing the Star Wars comics. However, this wasn't the only reason, as he told Starlog magazine he was only paid $2 per page and did not see a raise once Star Wars became a huge hit. He knew that the actors from the film and others such as Alan Dean Foster, who ghost wrote the novel to Star Wars, all got a bonus. Roy said all he ever got was an extra $500 for Marvel. When Mary Jo Duffy took over months before the release of Return of the Jedi, she and her Marvel team felt the hand of Lucasfilms with issue 73, Lazbane. Mary and artist Ron Friend created a forest planet ruled by fuzzy bears called Lazbees. Lucasfilm had been so busy with working on Return of the Jedi, they had been given Marvel the okay on many stories without reading them. They got the okay for the issue, and all was fine until almost release date. That's when they heard back from Lucasfilm on using the Endor-like planet with the Ewok-like creatures. Luckily, Marvel was able to work with Lucasfilm to save the story, as Lucasfilm only demand was that they change the Lazbees and color them as much as non-Ewok as they could. After the release of Return of the Jedi, Marvel and Mary Jo Duff moved on and kept working within the rules set by Lucasfilm. They hoped that after the release of the film, with no new films in the planning, that Lucas would loosen its grip, allow them more freedom in the storytelling. But they soon learned things were going to get a lot tighter, as Marvel received a new list of rules from Lucasfilms that included nothing is to be done to forward the love story between Han Solo and Princess Leia. Nobody in the story can know that Darth Vader is Luke and Leia's father. Nobody in the story can know that Luke and Leia are brother and sister. Writers are not allowed to do anything with the Force. Writers are not to do any stories on the Jedi Knights. Writers cannot use the Empire in any way. Now, with a whole new list of rules, and with no real enemy for the Star Wars heroes, what would Marvel and writer Mary Jo Duffy do to keep the series feeling like Star Wars and keeping Star Wars fans reading? The team marched on with brand new characters that they developed themselves, having a lot more control over. Even if, by Marvel, the comic book series was selling, it was lacking the quality of the earlier years. This was not due to the writing or even the work done by the artist. The stories were still strong, but without the fight between the rebels and the Empire, or the stories of Luke being a Jedi, the comics started to feel less and less like Star Wars, or at least the Star Wars we all knew and loved from the film. I was now doing stories that had less and less to do with Star Wars, and more to do with things I created out of a whole cloth, and stitching it into the Star Wars universe. I enjoyed doing it, but even those started being limited by the maybes of what Lucasfilm might do. It got to a point where there was no point. The hand of Lucasfilm would even start telling Mary what she could and could not do with the characters she created, the ones that had never appeared in any Star Wars films.
The one problem I ever had with Lucasfilm is they had a point where they began meddling with the characters that I had made up out of whole cloth.
Sure.
You can't do this with this character, you can't do that with that character, and it's like, but wait a minute. That character has never been anywhere near the movies. That character came out of this brain, and yes, but you can't do that.
Yeah.
And so we did hit a point where we were feeling a little stymied and frustrated.
In late 1985, Marvel, now wanting to focus more on their superhero comic books, and the Star Wars team feeling they were not really working on true Star Wars stories anymore, Marvel pulled the plug on the series, wrapping it all up with issue 107, all together now. However, would carry on another year with the Marvel Droids and Ewok comic book series. Marvel has always said the end was never due to any lack of sales in the Star Wars comics. But during this same time, Kenner canceled its popular Star Wars action figure line due to low sales. And with no Star Wars movies in sight, the merchandise of Star Wars was in a decline. Even if Marvel says this wasn't the case for them, it seems unlikely they did not see some type of decline near the end.
It was Marvel and not Lucasfilm that canceled the comic, and the sales were fine at the time I was on it.
Yeah.
But we did hit a point where we were feeling a little stymied and frustrated, and at the same time, Marvel was dramatically increasing its superhero line, and somebody said, oh, we need Joe and Cindy on other things anyway, so let's cancel that. And years after the movie, Star Wars had phenomenally good sales.
Yeah.
And frankly, Cindy and I would have kept doing it forever if we could have, or at least I know I would have, and that is, I think Cindy feels the same way.
Marvel would step away from Star Wars. They would even pass on bringing Star Wars back to the comic book stores in the early 90s, allowing Dark Horse Comics to reinvent the Star Wars comic book series, with what seemed like a lot less of a tight grip on the writers and artists, as Dark Horse was able to bring a more sequel-like feeling to Star Wars than anything the Marvel comics were allowed to do. So what did Mary Jo Duffy feel about the Dark Horse comics?
Oh my goodness gracious sakes alive. When that first Dark Horse comic came out, and it was all over and full of the stuff that I wasn't allowed to touch, and I knew that, it had come with the blessing of George, it gave me a pang.
With the success of the Dark Horse Star Wars comics, it seems the era of Marvel doing Star Wars was over. But then Disney came along and bought Marvel and Star Wars, bringing Star Wars back under the Marvel umbrella and setting their own rules.
Hey, Junkman channel popping though.
Thank you, sir, for that unsolicited testimony.